The morning began like any other at the federal courthouse on 5th Street. It was the sort of morning where the comfort of routine had made everyone a little careless. Lawyers hurried through the revolving doors, clutching their leather briefcases. Clerks balanced precarious stacks of files against their hips, and reporters lingered by the security checkpoint, hoping for a story worth their time. Word had spread overnight that a new judge would be taking the bench that day, someone brought in temporarily to help with an overloaded docket. No one seemed to know the name. Rumors raced through the hallways faster than facts could catch up. Some claimed the appointment had come from Washington. Others insisted it was merely an internal reassignment. Within minutes, the speculation had blossomed into something closer to gossip than information. No one paused to wonder why it mattered so deeply, only that mornings like this one often carried a weight no one could yet explain. Through the heavy glass doors walked a woman most people would have passed without a second glance. She wore a navy suit that had clearly seen better days, its cuffs slightly frayed, paired with sensible flat shoes made for walking rather than show. She carried no jewelry, no outward signs of importance, only a worn leather satchel that looked as though it had accompanied her through many long years. Her expression was calm in a way that made people uneasy, the kind of calm that didn't belong to someone nervous in an unfamiliar place. A few clerks assumed she was part of the custodial staff. Others thought she might be delivering paperwork for a family member. It was the sort of quick judgment people make when someone doesn't match their idea of what authority should look like. She said nothing to correct them, simply moving forward with the quiet resolve of someone who had walked similar corridors many times before, in many different buildings, under many different circumstances. That same calm caught the attention of a young court security officer stationed near the entrance to the attorney's lounge. His name was Officer Harlan Beck, a man still early in his career and carrying the firm certainty of someone who believed he knew exactly who belonged in a courthouse and who did not. He watched her approach the restricted hallway leading to the chambers, an area reserved for judges, senior clerks, and credentialed attorneys. To him, the calculation was simple. A woman dressed like that, walking with such confidence, had to be lost. Or worse, trying to go somewhere she had no right to be. He stepped directly into her path, one hand raised, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. The woman stopped, met his eyes without flinching, and waited for him to finish before she spoke a single word. People nearby began to slow their steps, sensing a tension that pulled at their attention even before they understood why. A few lawyers glanced over from near the elevators, more curious than worried. The air in the hallway seemed to shift, as though something ordinary was about to turn into something else. No one stepped in yet, because no one had a reason to believe it was necessary. Officer Beck's posture stayed firm, his tone edged with the impatience reserved for those he assumed wouldn't push back. As the seconds passed, the woman reached calmly for the leather satchel at her side, unhurried, as if she had known this exact moment would come long before she ever entered the building. What happened next would stay with everyone in that hallway for years to come, though in the moment, almost none of them grasped its true weight. Officer Beck told her flatly that the hallway was restricted to attorneys and court personnel only, and that she needed to turn back toward the public waiting area. She answered in a voice so even it almost sounded rehearsed, explaining that she had every right to be exactly where she stood. He gave a short laugh, the kind meant to be heard and repeated, and told her again as if she hadn't understood the first time. A few attorneys passing by slowed their steps, drawn by the tone more than the words, sensing the particular friction that arises when one person refuses to be dismissed and another refuses to listen. One man in an expensive gray suit, an attorney named Julian Crow, known throughout the building for his courtroom flair, smirked as he passed and said loudly enough for others to hear that everyone seemed to think they were a lawyer today. A ripple of laughter followed him down the hall, the kind that costs the giver nothing, and the receiver everything. The woman did not raise her voice. She reached into her satchel and drew out a folded document. Her temporary judicial appointment letter, bearing an official federal seal and the signature of the chief judge of the circuit. She held it out without ceremony, the way someone offers identification they have offered 1,000 times before. Officer Beck barely glanced at the paper before waving it away, declaring that he had seen people try to forge documents like that, and that he wasn't about to be fooled by some piece of paper printed off a computer. He told her plainly that he didn't care what it said. She needed to leave the hallway immediately, and continuing to argue would only make things worse for her. She held his gaze a moment longer, then took one calm step forward, intending only to walk past him toward the chambers she had every legal right to enter. That single step was more than he was willing to allow. His hand moved before anyone fully registered what was happening, an open palm striking across her face with enough force that the sound cracked through the marble hallway like a gunshot. The noise silenced every conversation within earshot. For a moment, no one moved. It was the kind of stillness that hangs in the air right before a room fully understands what it has just witnessed. The woman's head turned slightly from the impact, her hand rising instinctively to her cheek, though she did not stumble and did not cry out. A young court clerk near the elevator bank gasped audibly. Somewhere behind the group, someone actually laughed, a short, nervous, disbelieving sound, the kind people make when they don't know how else to process shock. No one stepped forward to intervene. No one asked if she was all right. The hallway, full of trained professionals sworn to uphold justice, simply watched. She did not scream. She did not lunge forward. She stood completely still for a few seconds, her hand still resting against her reddened cheek, her eyes locked directly on the man who had struck her in front of dozens of witnesses. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable, broken only by the quiet shuffle of someone shifting their weight, unsure whether to look away or keep watching. Officer Beck straightened his posture, seemingly satisfied that the matter had been settled, already reaching for the radio clipped to his shoulder, as though preparing to report a disturbance rather than reckon with what he had done. The woman lowered her hand slowly, and in that fragile, electric silence, she looked at him the way a person looks at someone they have already decided they will remember for the rest of their life. Rather than raising her voice or demanding apologies, the woman did something that confused everyone watching even more than the slap itself. She reached up and smoothed the lapel of her jacket, adjusting it with the unhurried precision of someone preparing for a meeting rather than recovering from an assault. She bent down, retrieved her satchel from where it had slipped slightly off her shoulder, and pressed 2 fingers gently against the corner of her mouth, checking for blood that thankfully wasn't there. Every motion she made carried the same eerie calm that had defined her from the moment she walked through the courthouse doors. It was not the calm of someone who hadn't felt the blow. It was the calm of someone who had decided long before this moment exactly how she would respond if something like this ever happened to her. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet enough that people had to lean in slightly to hear it. Yet somehow it carried more weight than if she had shouted. She told Officer Beck evenly that he had just made the single biggest mistake of his career. The words landed strangely in the hallway, too calm to be a threat, too certain to be dismissed as bravado. A few onlookers actually laughed at the statement, assuming it was an empty attempt to save face after being humiliated. Julian Crow, still lingering nearby with his colleagues, called out that threatening an officer of the court was a crime in itself, clearly enjoying the spectacle far more than the situation warranted. Officer Beck's expression hardened at her words, his hand drifting toward the handcuffs at his belt. His voice rose as he informed her that she was now under arrest for threatening a law enforcement officer inside a federal building. He reached for her wrist, fully intending to restrain her, when a frantic voice cut through the hallway from somewhere near the chamber's entrance. Another woman in a cardigan, clearly a senior court clerk, came hurrying down the corridor at a pace entirely unsuited to her age. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven. She called out again and again, addressing someone as "Your Honor," with an urgency that made several attorneys glance toward the courtroom doors, assuming she meant one of the sitting judges already inside. Officer Beck paused, confused, his hand still hovering near the woman's wrist, unsure who the clerk was even speaking to. The clerk, whose name was Miriam Shaw, and who had worked in that courthouse for many years, didn't slow down until she reached the small group gathered in the hallway. And when she finally stopped, she was standing directly in front of the woman who had just been struck across the face, not in front of anyone else. The hallway fell into a silence different from the one before, heavier somehow, charged with the particular dread of people realizing they had badly misjudged the situation. Miriam Shaw apologized profusely, her voice trembling as she explained that she had been searching the building for quite some time, unaware that the new judge had already arrived. And worse, unaware of what had just happened in that hallway. She turned toward Officer Beck with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and horror, asking him directly if he understood who he had just struck. He opened his mouth to respond, though no coherent words came out, his earlier confidence visibly draining from his face. Julian Crow, still standing nearby, slowly stopped smiling, his eyes shifting back and forth between the clerk and the woman in the worn navy suit, as the pieces began to fall into place in his mind. Several attorneys who had laughed only minutes earlier now stood frozen, the kind of frozen that comes from realizing a joke had landed on someone who was never meant to be the punchline. The clerk produced a black judicial robe she had been carrying, draped carefully over her arm, and held it out toward the woman with the kind of reverence usually reserved for ceremonial occasions. The woman accepted it without dramatics, slipping her arms through the sleeves and adjusting the collar with the same unhurried precision she had shown earlier when straightening her jacket after being struck. No one in the hallway said a word as she fastened the front of the robe, the dark fabric settling over her shoulders and transforming her instantly into someone the entire building was required to treat with absolute respect. She thanked Miriam quietly, her tone holding no trace of triumph, no flicker of vindication. Only the same measured composure she had carried since the moment she first arrived. Then she turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, leaving behind a hallway full of people who suddenly understood, far too late, exactly who they had been looking at all along. Officer Beck remained rooted in place, his earlier authority replaced by something closer to dawning panic, as the reality of what he had just done settled over him like a physical weight. He watched her walk away, the robe trailing slightly behind her, and for the first time that morning, he said absolutely nothing at all. Inside the courtroom, the gallery filled quickly, word having already spread through whispered conversations and hurried glances exchanged in the hallway outside. Attorneys took their seats with unusual stiffness, several of them stealing nervous glances toward the bench where the new judge would soon appear. Reporters who had been lingering near the entrance for an unrelated case suddenly found themselves scrambling for better seats, sensing that something far more significant than the scheduled docket was unfolding. The bailiff called the room to order, his voice slightly unsteady, clearly aware that the morning had already taken a turn no one had anticipated. When the door behind the bench opened, the room rose to its feet, the practiced motion of a courtroom honoring tradition. Though this time, the silence carried an unusual tension beneath its surface. The woman walked to the bench, with the same composed posture she had carried through the hallway minutes earlier, settling into the high-backed chair as though she had occupied it for years rather than minutes. She arranged the files in front of her, adjusted her microphone, and looked out over the courtroom with an expression that revealed nothing of what had just happened to her. The gavel came down once, sharp and deliberate, and the sound seemed to settle something in the room, a confirmation that whatever doubts remained about her authority had just been permanently resolved. Officer Beck, who had been escorted into the courtroom to await instructions, stood near the side wall with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his face drained of all the certainty he had carried only minutes before. Julian Crowe sat at the defense table for an unrelated case scheduled that morning, visibly uncomfortable, suddenly aware that the woman he had mocked in the hallway now held complete control over every argument he was about to make. Before beginning the scheduled proceedings, the judge looked directly down at Officer Beck, her gaze steady and entirely without malice. She told him simply that they would speak after the session concluded. Her tone carried no threat, no anger, nothing beyond the plain statement of fact. He nodded once, unable to find words, and the courtroom held its breath as she turned her attention back to the docket in front of her, beginning the day's proceedings as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The first case called that morning involved a complex contractual dispute between two corporations, the kind of dry, technical matter that typically drained the energy out of any courtroom within minutes. Julian Crowe, representing one of the parties, approached with his usual confidence, the same theatrical flair that had served him well in front of dozens of judges over the years. He began laying out his argument with practiced charm, the kind designed to win over a bench through charisma rather than substance. Within the first few minutes, the new judge interrupted him, her question precise and unforgiving, pointing directly at a flaw in his reasoning that none of his previous judges had ever caught. Crowe stumbled, recovering quickly, only to be met with another question moments later, sharper than the first, dismantling the foundation of his argument piece by piece. The courtroom began to understand that something remarkable was happening, the kind of realization that spreads through a room without anyone needing to say it aloud. This was not simply a competent judge handling a routine case. This was someone whose command of the law exceeded anything most of the attorneys present had encountered in years of practice. Crowe's confidence cracked further with each ruling, his objections overruled with citations he hadn't even considered. His strategy unraveled under questions that revealed a depth of legal knowledge bordering on encyclopedic. By the time the morning session reached its midpoint, the laughter from earlier in the hallway felt as though it belonged to an entirely different lifetime, replaced now by a kind of stunned, reluctant respect rippling through the gallery. Reporters in the back row began typing furiously into their phones, no longer interested in the contractual dispute itself, but in the identity of the woman presiding over it. Whispers passed from seat to seat, attorneys leaning toward one another, trying to recall where they might have heard her name before. Someone in the gallery finally typed the right combination of words into a search engine, and within seconds, a name surfaced that sent a visible ripple of shock through the rows of seated spectators. The name belonged to a federal judge whose reputation in legal circles bordered on legendary, someone known for landmark rulings and an almost unmatched record of overturned wrongful convictions earlier in her career as a public defender. Several attorneys actually paled at the realization, recalculating in real time exactly how badly the morning's events were about to affect their professional standing. By the time the session adjourned for a brief recess, half the courtroom had already learned her name, and the other half was scrambling to catch up. The name belonged to Judge Evelyn Harper, a woman whose path to that courtroom had been carved through decades of obstacles most people in that building had never come close to facing. She had grown up in a small, struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of a major city, raised primarily by her grandmother after her mother passed away when she was only 9 years old. Money was scarce throughout her childhood, the kind of scarcity that meant skipped meals some weeks and second-hand textbooks every year of school. She excelled academically despite the odds stacked against her, earning a scholarship to a respected university that many people in her neighborhood doubted she would ever attend. Even there, she faced relentless skepticism from professors who assumed her admission had been a mistake, classmates who whispered that she didn't belong, and administrators who questioned her credentials at nearly every turn. She applied to law school against the advice of several mentors who warned her that the field remained largely closed to people who looked like her, particularly in the elite circles she hoped to enter. She was rejected by 3 schools before finally being accepted into a program on a partial scholarship, supplementing the remaining cost through night shifts at a diner that left her exhausted before most of her classes even began. Despite the long hours and constant financial strain, she graduated at the very top of her class, an achievement that surprised everyone except the people who had watched her work tirelessly for years without complaint. She took a position as a public defender immediately after graduation, choosing a path that paid far less than corporate law firms had offered her because she believed deeply in representing people the system too often discarded. Over the years that followed, she built a reputation for overturning wrongful convictions, exposing police misconduct, and dismantling cases built on flawed evidence, earning both respect and resentment from different corners of the legal world. Her appointment to the federal bench had been historic, making her one of the youngest federal judges in the circuit's history, though she rarely discussed the achievement publicly. She remained famously private about her personal life, preferring substance over spectacle, often choosing simplicity in her appearance, specifically to avoid the kind of attention that came with status. Colleagues who knew her well understood this choice intimately, recognizing it as a quiet, deliberate experiment she had carried out for years. She wanted to know, in unguarded moments, how people treated someone who appeared to have no power at all. And on that particular morning, walking into an unfamiliar courthouse in a worn suit and flat shoes, she had finally received an answer more revealing than she ever could have imagined. Those who had worked alongside her during her years as a public defender often spoke of the same quality, describing a woman who never raised her voice in a courtroom, even when opposing counsel resorted to insults or intimidation, who instead let the strength of her preparation speak louder than any outburst could. She had represented clients other attorneys refused to take, cases tangled in decades of biased policing and outdated forensic methods, spending nights poring over transcripts long after her colleagues had gone home. 3 of her cases had resulted in exonerations for men who had spent years, in one instance, more than a decade, imprisoned for crimes they had never committed. Convictions built on shaky eyewitness testimony and investigative shortcuts nobody had bothered to question until she arrived. Each exoneration had cost her something personally. Sleepless months chasing evidence that prosecutors insisted didn't exist, threats from people unhappy with cases being reopened, and a steady accumulation of enemies within institutions that preferred their old verdicts left undisturbed. Yet she never spoke of these victories as triumphs over individuals, choosing instead to frame them publicly as proof that the system needed constant, careful correction rather than blind trust. Her elevation to the federal bench had not come easily either, despite the eventual unanimous praise that followed her confirmation. Several senators during her confirmation hearings had questioned her temperament, suggesting, without much subtlety, that a background defending the poor and the wrongly accused made her unsuitable for the impartiality the role demanded. She had answered each question without defensiveness, calmly explaining that impartiality did not mean pretending inequality didn't exist, only that the law had to be applied consistently, regardless of who stood in front of the bench. The confirmation eventually passed, though narrowly, and she entered the federal judiciary, carrying both the weight of expectation and the quiet skepticism of colleagues who still weren't entirely convinced she belonged there. She proved them wrong steadily, ruling after ruling, never through spectacle, but through the same patient, exacting diligence that had defined her entire career. The session continued well past the original recess time, the gallery seemingly unable to look away even as the docket moved through smaller, less dramatic matters. A second attorney, representing the opposing party in the contractual dispute, found himself similarly outmatched, though he adjusted more gracefully than Crow had, recognizing early that bluster would serve him poorly in front of someone who clearly valued precision above performance. Judge Harper asked pointed questions about jurisdiction, about prior rulings buried deep in obscure appellate records, references so specific that several attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, wondering how anyone could recall such details without consulting notes. She consulted no notes. Her questions arrived as though pulled directly from memory, each one narrowing the case toward its actual substance, rather than the theatrical arguments both sides had clearly prepared in advance. By the time she issued her preliminary ruling on a procedural motion, the gallery had stopped whispering altogether, watching instead with the kind of attentive silence usually reserved for moments people sense they will later be asked to describe. Court staff who had worked in that building for years later admitted they had never seen a first-day judge command a courtroom with such immediate authority, the kind that typically took newcomers months, sometimes years, to develop. One veteran bailiff remarked quietly to a colleague that whatever had happened in that hallway earlier clearly hadn't rattled her in the slightest, that if anything, she seemed sharper for it, more deliberate, as though channeling the morning's injustice into something productive rather than letting it consume her focus. The contrast between her composure on the bench and the chaos that had preceded it became, in itself, a kind of quiet statement, one that needed no further explanation. Attorneys who had laughed in the hallway now found themselves taking careful notes, recalculating how they would need to prepare for any future appearance in her courtroom. And as the morning session finally drew toward its close, it had become abundantly clear to everyone present that this was not simply a story about an act of violence, but the beginning of something far larger that none of them could yet fully see. By the time the recess ended, the video capturing the entire incident, recorded by a bystander's phone near the elevator bank, had already begun circulating beyond the walls of the courthouse. Within hours, the footage had reached news desks across the country. The image of a federal judge being struck across the face by a court security officer proved impossible for any outlet to ignore. The story spread with the kind of speed reserved for moments that touch something deeper than a single news cycle, something raw and immediate that people couldn't look away from. Anchors on national broadcasts replayed the footage repeatedly, slowing it down frame by frame, dissecting every second of the encounter for audiences hungry for explanation. Legal analysts appeared on screen within the same afternoon, debating accountability, procedure, and the deeper implications of what the footage revealed about assumptions made in professional spaces. Strangers who had never set foot inside that courthouse found themselves drawn into the story anyway, recognizing something uncomfortably familiar in the footage, even if they couldn't name it precisely. Parents spoke about it at dinner tables, explaining to their children why a stranger's bad assumption could carry such heavy consequences for someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Retired judges wrote opinion columns reflecting on decades spent watching courthouses slowly modernize, while certain habits of suspicion seemed to linger no matter how much progress was claimed elsewhere. Civil rights organizations released statements within the same week, careful not to politicize the judge's own words, but using the moment to highlight patterns they had documented for years in similar institutions nationwide. Even some attorneys who had never met Judge Harper personally found themselves defending her publicly, recalling rumors of her reputation from years earlier and expressing disbelief that someone with her record could have been treated so carelessly. Officer Beck was placed on immediate administrative leave before the day even ended, the department moving with unusual speed given the scale of public attention already gathering around the case. An internal investigation was launched, though few people inside or outside the courthouse believed it would conclude in his favor. Julian Crow found himself facing a different kind of consequence entirely, as clips of his earlier comment about everyone thinking they were a lawyer began circulating alongside the footage of the slap. Clients who had once valued his courtroom charisma began quietly distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with a man captured mocking a federal judge moments before she was assaulted. The State Bar Association announced it would review his conduct as well, citing concerns about professionalism, unrelated to the courtroom that morning, but suddenly impossible to ignore. Despite the storm gathering around her, Judge Harper made no public statements in the days that followed. She declined every interview request, ignored the cameras gathering outside the courthouse entrance, and continued arriving for work at the same early hour she always had. When a reporter finally managed to ask her directly whether she intended to pursue personal legal action against Officer Beck, she answered with a brief, measured response that surprised nearly everyone who heard it. She said only that she expected the appropriate process to unfold properly. Nothing more, nothing less. The restraint in her answer, especially given what she had endured, only deepened the public's growing respect for her, transforming the story from a simple tale of injustice into something closer to a portrait of quiet, deliberate integrity. The internal disciplinary hearing took place in the weeks that followed, held in a closed conference room within the same courthouse where the incident had occurred. Officer Beck sat across from a review panel composed of senior officials, his posture stiff, his earlier bravado entirely absent from his demeanor. When asked to explain his actions, he insisted repeatedly that he had simply been doing his job, enforcing security protocols he believed had been violated by someone refusing to comply with reasonable instructions. He claimed she had been aggressive, that she had attempted to push past him despite his repeated warnings, framing his response as a necessary reaction to perceived defiance rather than an unprovoked act of violence. The panel listened without interruption, their expressions carefully neutral, giving no indication of how his account was landing. Then the courthouse's security footage was brought into the room, captured from multiple angles, covering the exact hallway where the incident occurred. The recording showed, with undeniable clarity, every moment of the encounter exactly as witnesses had described it. There was no aggressive movement on her part, no shoving, no raised voice, nothing resembling the resistance Beck had described under questioning. The footage showed her producing identification calmly, attempting only a single measured step forward before the strike landed across her face without warning or provocation. The room remained silent as the video played twice more at the panel's request. The second viewing was slowed enough to remove any ambiguity about what had actually transpired. By the time the footage finished playing the second time, Officer Beck's expression had changed entirely. The last traces of his earlier justification visibly collapsed under the weight of what the recording proved beyond dispute. One panel member asked him directly whether he wished to revise his earlier statement, given what the footage showed. He said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the table in front of him, finally admitting in a quiet voice that he had reacted out of frustration rather than any genuine security concern. The admission, though brief, effectively ended any possibility of defending his actions further. Everyone in the room understood, without needing to be told explicitly, that his career within the department had reached its conclusion. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Judge Harper was approached repeatedly by reporters, advocacy groups, and even other officials within the judicial system who wanted to know whether she intended to file a civil lawsuit against the department. She met each inquiry with the same calm consistency she had shown from the very beginning. When a journalist finally asked her plainly during a rare brief interview whether she sought any personal compensation for what had happened to her, she answered without hesitation that compensation had never been her goal. She explained that what she wanted instead was simply for the system to function the way it was designed to function. Nothing inflated, nothing symbolic, just basic accountability applied evenly, regardless of who stood on either side of an incident. She made it clear she had no interest in humiliating Officer Beck further or extracting public vengeance for what he had done. Instead, she requested only a handful of specific changes, presented through formal channels rather than public statements. She asked for mandatory implicit bias training to be incorporated into security personnel onboarding across the courthouse system. Training designed to address the exact kind of snap judgment that had led to that morning's events. She requested a clearer, more transparent protocol for verifying credentials, one that didn't rely solely on an officer's personal assessment of who looked like they belonged in a particular space. She also asked for an independent review process to be established for any future use of force incidents occurring within courthouse walls, ensuring that situations like hers wouldn't be left solely in the hands of internal departments with potential conflicts of interest. Finally, she asked that the principle behind these changes be stated explicitly, that every person entering that building, regardless of appearance, deserved to be treated with basic respect until proven otherwise. When these requests became public, something shifted in how people discussed the entire situation. The story stopped being framed purely as outrage over an assault and began being framed instead as a demonstration of restraint, principle, and quiet moral clarity. Legal commentators noted that she could have pursued far harsher consequences, financially and professionally, yet had chosen instead to focus on structural change rather than personal retribution. Colleagues who had worked alongside her for years said the response didn't surprise them in the slightest, describing it as entirely consistent with the values she had quietly upheld throughout her career. Inside the courthouse itself, staff members who had witnessed the entire incident began speaking more openly, several admitting privately that they regretted not intervening sooner, that the hesitation they felt in that hallway had revealed something uncomfortable about their own assumptions. In time, the institutional changes she had requested were gradually implemented, not through dramatic announcements, but through quiet procedural shifts that altered the way the courthouse operated day to day. New training protocols were introduced for every security officer working within the building, focusing specifically on recognizing and counteracting unconscious bias in moments of perceived authority. A clearer verification process was put in place for confirming credentials, removing much of the subjective judgment that had contributed to the events of that morning. An independent oversight committee was established to review any future incidents involving force used against visitors, attorneys, or officials within the courthouse, ensuring accountability extended beyond internal departmental review. None of these changes received significant media coverage outside legal circles. Yet, within the building itself, the shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Other courthouses across the region, watching the case unfold from a distance, began quietly adopting similar measures without waiting for mandates to force their hand. A handful of state-level judicial committees invited Judge Harper to speak about her experience, requests she largely declined, preferring instead to submit written recommendations that administrators could implement, without turning her into a public spokesperson for the cause. She insisted, whenever the subject arose, that the value of what happened lay not in her individual story, but in the pattern it exposed, a pattern repeated daily in waiting rooms, hallways, and front desks across the country, mostly without cameras present to record it. Officer Beck, for his part, was formally terminated from his position in the weeks after the disciplinary hearing concluded, the department citing a clear violation of use of force standards alongside conduct unbecoming of a court security officer. He did not appeal the decision publicly, and reporters who attempted to reach him for comment in the months that followed received no response. Miriam Shaw, the clerk who had rushed down the hallway that morning, later admitted in a brief conversation with a colleague that she replayed those frantic minutes in her mind more often than she expected to, wondering what might have happened had she arrived even a minute later. She said it taught her something about urgency, about never assuming there would be time to fix a wrong once it had already been set into motion. Several junior clerks who witnessed the incident firsthand requested transfers to different floors in the weeks that followed, unable to shake the discomfort of having stood silently in that hallway without intervening. Judge Harper never criticized any of them for their hesitation, understanding perhaps better than anyone how fear and uncertainty could freeze even well-intentioned people in moments that demanded courage. She simply continued doing her work, modeling through her own conduct the kind of steadiness she hoped others might eventually find within themselves. Judge Harper continued presiding over her courtroom with the same quiet focus she always had, never referencing the incident publicly unless directly asked, never allowing it to define how she approached her work. She remained known for the same sharp legal mind that had stunned the courtroom that first morning. Her rulings continued to reflect the depth of knowledge built over decades of difficult, often thankless work. Attorneys who once underestimated her based on appearance learned quickly never to make that mistake twice. Her reputation spread through the legal community with a speed that mirrored the original video, though for entirely different reasons. Julian Crow, having faced his own consequences in the aftermath, eventually appeared before her courtroom again on an unrelated matter. His demeanor was notably humbled, his earlier theatrics entirely absent. She treated him with the same professional neutrality she extended to every attorney who appeared before her, neither punishing him further nor pretending the earlier incident hadn't happened. Later, a reporter who had followed the story since its earliest days requested an interview, hoping to ask the question that had lingered in so many people's minds since that very first morning. The reporter asked her directly whether she ever regretted not simply identifying herself the moment Officer Beck first confronted her, wondering aloud whether doing so might have prevented the entire ordeal altogether. Judge Harper considered the question for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. She explained that if she had announced her title immediately, any respect she received afterward would have been directed solely at the robe, at the title, at the authority the position carried, rather than at her. As a person standing in that hallway, what she had wanted to understand, she said, was something far simpler and far more uncomfortable. Whether basic human dignity would be extended to someone before any title was ever revealed. She added quietly that the answer she received that morning had been disappointing, but not surprising. The kind of confirmation that hurt precisely because it wasn't unexpected. What had mattered more to her in the months that followed was not punishing the people who failed that test, but ensuring the system itself made that kind of failure less likely to repeat. She spoke about her grandmother briefly, recalling lessons learned in childhood about meeting cruelty with composure rather than matching it, about responding to injustice with clarity instead of vengeance. She mentioned, almost in passing, that true authority had never come from a title or a robe in her experience, but from the steadiness with which a person carried themselves when no one expected them to have any power at all. The interview ended shortly afterward, the reporter thanking her for her time, the cameras slowly being packed away as the courthouse around them continued its ordinary rhythm. As the recording equipment was carried out of the room, Judge Harper gathered her files and walked toward the courtroom for her afternoon docket, the same unhurried pace she had carried since the very first morning anyone in that building had ever seen her. Clerks greeted her respectfully as she passed. Attorneys stepped aside without being asked, and the hallway that had once been the site of such public humiliation now felt entirely transformed by her presence within it. Miriam Shaw, still working at the clerk's desk near the chambers, smiled quietly as the judge walked by. The two exchanged a brief nod that carried more meaning than either of them needed to put into words. Even Julian Crow, passing through the same corridor on his way to a different courtroom, paused for a moment to acknowledge her, his earlier arrogance long since replaced by something closer to genuine respect. She entered the courtroom, and as always, everyone rose to their feet, not out of fear, not out of obligation to a title, but out of something that had been earned slowly, deliberately, through countless choices made when easier paths had been readily available. The gavel came down once again, marking the beginning of another ordinary session in an extraordinary career. The kind of session that would never make headlines, and never needed to. Outside the courthouse, the city continued its usual rhythm, unaware that inside those walls, a quiet revolution in expectation and accountability had taken root, one that would likely outlast every person who had witnessed its beginning. And somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, in households and newsrooms and conversations that had followed her story, people continued to repeat the words she had once offered so simply during that interview, words that had outlasted the headlines and outlived the outrage. Justice, she had said, does not begin the moment someone puts on a robe. It begins far earlier than that, in the way we choose to treat the people we assume hold no power at all. And long after the cameras had gone home, long after the story had faded from the front pages and settled instead into something quieter and more permanent, that single idea remained, carried forward by everyone who had stood in that hallway and learned in the span of a few unbearable seconds exactly how much they still had left to learn about themselves.